Today we're going to take a close look and break down one of my favorite paintings by John Singer Sargent. A few weeks ago I was able to see it in person and I was able to get some pretty decent high-res images. We're going to zoom in and talk about some of the interesting brushstrokes and some of the things that might have been going through Sargent's head. We're going to try to break down the technique and see what we can learn from this painting. This is the image that I have. I initially captured it with its frame, but I found a second image online which had a little bit of the edges, which proved to be very interesting and insightful. And that leads us to the first thing that we can see about this painting, which is the support that it was painted on. This painting was not actually made on canvas or linen. It was actually made on a wooden board. We can see that on the edges, the orange color from the wood, some of the grain, and we can also even see a little bit of the texture of the grain running across the painting. In some places, the painting is very transparent and a lot of the color of the wood is showing through. I'm not exactly sure what kind of panel this may have been, if this was oak or maple, but some of the important things when we're working on a surface is its surface texture, its absorbency, and also its tone. So in terms of surface texture, a wooden panel, it's going to be relatively smooth, but it's going to have just a little bit of grit to it because of the little actual grain of the wood itself. It's not going to be a perfectly smooth panel like a gesso board or maybe a aluminum die bond panel or a copper panel. Sometimes people paint on metal, which is perhaps the extreme of slippery and slick. The absorbency, I'm not really sure what the absorbency was. I have a hint that it doesn't look like this was too much of an absorbent surface because the brushstrokes themselves look to be fairly fluid enough in the way that they're mixing in here. When you're working on a surface that is really dry, the oil just immediately gets sucked into the panel and then it actually becomes very, very hard to paint because the paint actually doesn't want to move across the surface. Now, the last part about the surface that's really interesting is its color. The orange of this wood that's showing through right now, it is a very warm color. Sometimes artists would use an orange ground because they enjoyed the way that the warmth ends up percolating through the painting as it's finished. This color reminds me of the orange of my paint box. So the paint box that I built years ago, it looks like this on the outside. What I did to achieve this color is I just finished this box with raw linseed oil. So raw linseed oil eventually comes to look like a very beautiful amber orangish color. So it's possible this wood was finished with linseed oil, or it's possible it was finished with another type of oil that would basically impregnate the wood and make it relatively non-absorbent. Finishing oils have been used on wood for millennia, so it's pretty good for the longevity as well. But the very interesting point is the color, which is something that I've touched on in previous videos, how important it seemed it was for Sargent to work on toned surfaces. It's very rare that you find a work of Sargent's which was painted on an untoned white surface. The next thing that I noticed about this painting while looking over it is the variety between thick and thin paint. Let's take a close look. Throughout this painting, we have a big passage of light in the top right, and at the bottom and to the side, we have a large ambient shadow for the bottom of the courtyard and the side walls. When we zoom in, we see just how juicy these brushstrokes are on this wall, here within the doors, and even here up top. And we see how this contrasts against the shadows. In a lot of places, the shadows are really thin. In some areas, even letting the wood panel show through, such as in here, in here, in here, and all throughout the bottom. Having thick lights and thin shadows is a very often repeated convention in oil painting, but why is this the case? Well, there are several reasons why artists work in this sort of way. On one hand, we have to consider the paint that Sargent was actually using. One of the reasons that this convention evolved is because the paint that Sargent was using back in the day, titanium white didn't exist yet. Zinc white was starting to get its way into painting, but at this point, I'm not sure if it was commonly used. Most artists used lead white, which is naturally a very thick and pasty pigment. It has a lot of body to it, and it doesn't have a lot of tinting power. So when painting their lights, you would have to use more white, and it would be very textured. Lead has a thixotropic quality to it, meaning the more you work it, the more textured and jagged it actually is. And so anytime you have a lot of lead, your brushstrokes are basically going to keep their shape. Another aspect is the actual effect of the painting. When you have raised ridges like these, what happens is that these raised ridges actually are somewhat three-dimensional. They have a form in of themselves, and what happens is they catch a lot of glare. So you can see throughout this painting, it's in the lights where we have all these brushstrokes that are catching a ton of glare. And in contrast, when your shadows are painted relatively thinly and they're not catching a lot of glare, it's a very subtle effect that from across the room, it gives a whole new level of depth and light to the painting when it's working really well. The next thing that catches my eye about this painting are Sargent's brushstrokes, the texture, and the way that he builds up edges throughout the painting and how this all ties together. We can see that the lights are super textured and they have a ton of paint, and the shadows don't quite have the same texture. They don't quite have the same level of paint, but how's he actually applying the paint? In some areas, he has big brushstrokes just coming down and sweeping. In other areas, this is really interesting, he has much smaller brushstrokes as he's coming in and fuzzying this edge up. Then this is like a very active edge, but it's not a very hard and clean edge like we find right in here. So there's a very clean brushstroke causing very sharp edge, and that very much contrasts this edge of the cast shadow. This is a really masterful use of a very fundamental principle in painting, understanding cast shadows and form shadows, and understanding the variety of edges that come from them. So as something is a cast shadow further away from the original source, it becomes softer than a cast shadow that is closer to the original source. When there is a very gradual form transition, there's also a very soft edge. So what are some of the other brushstrokes that we are finding in this? Well, we see that there are some big brushstrokes for the paint here. There's some really small ones down in here. Throughout the bottom, when there are very thinly applied layers of paint, we see how they are just sort of pitter-pattering around. And we also see a lot of lost edges and the way that he is losing an edge along a single line. So this door specifically is very interesting because it has a nice hard clean edge at the top, but then down here there's a little bit of a dry brushing effect as that edge runs down and it's getting feathered in to the sides. But most importantly, one of my favorite parts about this painting is specifically this red door. I think this door itself is just such a masterpiece in the way that it was actually painted. What we see is the red door recessed into the courtyard behind the white stone of this typical Moroccan building. We see that there's a certain level of patina on the door itself, and there's a cast light down here, and there is also a cast shadow at the top and at the bottom. This is also a really great example of there's a very sharp cast shadow at the top of this door, and there's a very soft cast shadow from what we presume is the building behind us, which is casting this shadow along this entire courtyard. So this entire shadow being cast by this courtyard is relatively soft, and we see it throughout the painting. We also see that in here, it's really soft. But then this is a much relatively just a little bit of a sharper edge. And this right here is a much sharper edge as well. But we see that so much clearer in here. We see Sargent carving that out, carving the light red up against the dark red, and then interestingly brushing that away. And the really specific bits that really got me about this painting is the use of this accented shadow line that's running down the left-hand side of this door. So this is something that I think had to have been painted with a specialty brush. So not the filberts that Sargent seemed to have most often used, but a very thin and long sable brush that would hold a lot of fluid paint and draw a really thin line. You know, generally these brushes are called script liners, and they are just long and thin, and they're made for drawing a really small line down that. In this small area, it's just a masterpiece of all these important fundamental ideas, and the way that he's orchestrating the entire painting is just amazing. Big, thick paint working up on this edge. Here, very thin paints, very scratchy, dragging the brushstroke along the form to actually show what is presumably the wooden paneling of this door and the patina, so the grain probably going with this. And then my favorite part might be these little marks, these impastos in here, the way that he's dragging some of the lights down in here, how he has just these really small lines The amazing part about this painting is the extreme level of variety that Sargent's getting within his paintings. This is kind of an early work for him. I think Sargent did this when he was in his 20s, long before his mature style, but in some ways I actually appreciate this painting all the more because it doesn't have that same just juicy brushstroke that Sargent ended up developing after he spent a lot of time with Monet, but it has a lot more variety. That's something that I was always drawn to in his earlier work. To me, variety is king in painting. Some artists want to paint with a single brushstroke all the time. Me, I like it when I see things painted differently depending on the different elements in the scene. Now, if you're enjoying this, before the next step, I should say that if you want to get access to this image and many more of the high-res images that I found over the years or that I've taken myself, you can access them by signing up to my Patreon for free. There's a pinned post that is unlocked to all members, not just the paid ones, and you'll be able to see that there. There's a link to it. Special Google Drive where all these images are. And if you'd want to even subscribe to the actual Patreon, well, then you'll be able to watch me actually go through the process of painting this on this little wooden panel I have here. It's to size. I'm really excited. This painting is relatively small. It's something you don't see a lot from Sargent's, but it's almost at the scale that I most commonly work with. So doing this for myself, also because I want to do this copy before I start that big painting over there, I want to see if there's anything I could learn from it. And there's one really cool thing about this painting that blew my mind that I want to really get to. The Patreon link's down there if you'd like to join, if you want to see some of these high-res images, and if you ever want to look at some of the more in-depth painting tutorials. But anyway, back to this painting. A small but very important thing about this painting that I think really brings this painting to life is the way that Sargent separates out light and shadow in a specific way. And specifically within this red door, the way that the patina on the door is in light and white, and the way that it transitions underneath this cast shadow of the red transitioning into a very dark red and the white transitioning into this light gray, the way that color transitions as it goes from a passage of light into shadow. We realize that the things in the shadow aren't just the color in the light made darker. They're an entirely different color. They're an entirely different mixture. And having little moments of connection like this, the way that this red travels into here, the way that the white travels into the shadow of the top of the arch, just along the entire wall, and the way that the light travels on this greener wall on the left-hand side. That is a really small detail, but the excellent handling at each and every one of these stages really brings this painting to life. The next thing about this painting that really stands out to me is Sargent's understanding of optics. Optics is the way that light behaves and interacts with the world around it, and also how we perceive that light. One of the effects that we're first introduced to when we are learning about optical effects about drawing and painting is actually about reflection and bounce light. We understand how light enters a scene and it bounces around. When we're first drawing a value sphere, we often lighten up the shadows a little bit because we know that the light is bouncing into those shadows. And how do we see that in here? Well, we see that here in the corner of these two walls, as the two walls approach downward, it's actually bouncing into each other and lightening up the effect just a little bit in here. We see a little bit of bouncing color. So here, this red light of the door is bouncing up into the top of the arch up here. Another optical effect that is closely related to bounce light is something called occlusion. Imagine that a scene just has a bunch of ambient light bouncing around everywhere. You would imagine the places that the light wouldn't be reaching would be cracks and crevices, things that are in small edges and corners, basically things that aren't facing this wide open space where there's all this light bouncing around, like a small crevice, such as the crevices at the top of this door. So here, because there is this indentation of this archway as it's going to this wall that's recessed, the very top of it receives less light than the larger aspect of the wall below it. So there's less light. That's called an occlusive shadow. And we see that happening around a bunch of little edges. Sometimes it's actually just dirt, but that is another important optical effect. So occlusive shadows are the way that cracks can get a little bit darker sometimes. And so by understanding these simple concepts of bounce light or occlusive shadows, we can start seeing that there are big transitions and subtle movements of light and color and value throughout entire passages. So moving down the wall, transitioning from this edge, coming down, seeing how this area is a little bit lighter and it transitions to be a little bit darker. Nothing is ever perfectly flat when we look at it in nature, and understanding optics, Sargent was able to make use of that and really capture that in this painting. But the final thing that I find really impressive about this painting is the fact that Sargent was not painting mere things anymore. The total ensemble of this painting is that Sargent was primarily painting the effect of light on these objects. A lot of people, if they were to paint something like this, they may be tempted to go into every little detail, to paint every little nook. But if we pay attention to the way that Sargent handles some of these details, so looking in on some of the designs at the top of this archway, we see how, they're just simple brush marks. The corners of perhaps what are these, maybe jams, I'm not entirely sure, and then this little level on the ground, this shadow, as it looks like there's a raised platform above here, above maybe some more gravelly dirt below it. Sargent wasn't going into painting every detail because he was focusing on painting the effect of light, not just these objects. The sharpness that he was giving to specific elements as well is showing that he was also giving a focus to what I think is this door. He was painting this door as if it was the primary focus, and he had the rest of this painting slowly soften out as if in our peripheral vision we are slowly fading these things away. And so in a way, this painting to me, it looks like a masterpiece because it is really hitting on this idea I've had recently about a visual pyramid when we are learning in painting. It's this idea that I've had, that I've recognized within myself, that when you start learning to paint, there are certain things that come naturally and that you want to tackle first. So drawing with contours, that is a very basic thing. Understanding the flat values of shapes, understanding optics is the next thing, understanding a little bits of color, understanding more advanced optics, bounce light, occlusive shadows, things like this. Little by little, we slowly start to peel back the layers that are behind what makes really good painting, and we start to add these layers into our own painting, and we start to push the realism. And one of the final layers, aside from learning that we are actually painting the light that we see, but it's actually painting what and how we see, giving a specific focus to a certain thing in our painting and letting the rest sort of fall out of focus, the way that we actually see when we focus on a single object. Everything else fades into the periphery, it softens away. That, along with the really subtle attention to light and shadow within this painting, and along with the execution, the variety within the brushstroke and within the color. I mean, we didn't even touch the fact that he, just for fun, is putting these flicks of viridian and it looks like cobalt throughout the painting, just to add a little bit of complementary colors throughout the painting to push a little bit of the color vibration. I mean, it's a perfect little painting. So I pointed out to my palette earlier, I will be making a little master copy of this painting, primarily for myself, because this is a painting that, I wasn't lying, I saw this painting for the first time on Instagram back in April, and then it was in the back of my mind as I was painting through Florence and Venice and painting all these doors and these weathered patinas. This painting inspired a lot of my paintings for weeks and weeks, and so I think there's really something special in this painting. I'd love to do a little copy of it, and I think that may be something that some of you guys might be able to learn from. So the master copy tutorial, that's going to be on my Patreon. If you want to see the high-res image of this and some of the other paintings I've captured over the years, that is available through a Google Drive link for anyone that is a free member of my Patreon, and the link to that's below. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and catch you next time.